Welcome to the Sierra Fund's Environmentally Healthy Communities in the Sierra Nevada Headwaters. The Sierra Fund is a nonprofit located in the heart of the gold country in Nevada City. Since 2001, we have spearheaded an extremely effective effort to address gold rush impacts on our headwaters. Our mission is to restore ecosystem and community resiliency in the Sierra Nevada region. And our mission works to confront the legacy of impacts from the 19th century gold rush that persists to this day in our region, with implications for all of California, from the Sierra to the sea. We specifically work within three intertwined programs: our Ecosystem Resiliency Program, our Environmentally Healthy Communities Program, and our Capacity Building Program. These programs support each other with cross-cutting objectives. Within our Environmentally Healthy Communities Program, we look at mercury in fish, so preventing public exposure to legacy mining contaminants, specifically mercury. In a similar vein, we look at dusty exposures, preventing exposure to legacy mining contaminants associated with dust. We also look at water quality and water access, with the goal of engaging underrepresented and disadvantaged community members in projects that improve their access to clean water. And finally, we're working to empower action that fosters climate resilience through a reduction of wildfire risk and the protection of public health in the event of poor air quality associated with wildfire. The objective of our Environmentally Healthy Communities program is to increase the amount and accessibility of information about legacy exposure pathways, with the goal of restoring headwater communities as healthy places to live, work, and play, with clean water, soil, and air. The first component of our Environmentally Healthy Communities program is mercury in fish. The connection between mercury in fish and the California gold rush is that mercury was mined extensively in the Coast Range, circled here in red, and imported to the Sierra Nevada for use in gold processing at gold mines, circled here in yellow. As a result of the extensive use of mercury during the gold rush, the Sierra Nevada region has some of the most contaminated watersheds in the state. The South Yuba and Bear River watershed and American River watershed are among the most contaminated in the Sierra Nevada. Mercury in watersheds is a concern and a link to the gold rush because the main source of mercury in the aquatic environment in California is past gold and mercury mining activities. During the gold rush, approximately 26 million pounds of mercury was used, with an estimated 10 to 13 million pounds lost to the environment. Or in other words, that mercury simply washed into dirt at hydraulic mines, becoming embedded in fine silts and clays, or it was discarded in stamp mill waste from hard rock mines, in contaminated mill sands. This mercury continues to wash off the landscape into watersheds, and the primary pathway of human exposure to mercury, which is a developmental neurotoxin, is through the consumption of contaminated fish. Mercury washes off of mine sites and enters aquatic ecosystems, so our rivers and our streams, where it can wash downstream and become trapped behind the dams of reservoirs. And this can be particularly problematic because at the bottom of reservoirs, you have very low oxygen conditions in combination with sulfate-reducing bacteria, and that can result in the methylation of mercury. The mercury that was used at gold mines was in an elemental form, which is not what we consider to be bioavailable or able to be incorporated into the food web. When elemental mercury enters an aquatic ecosystem and there's low oxygen conditions and sulfate-reducing bacteria, that elemental mercury can methylate into methylmercury, which is a bioavailable form. Once that happens, you have two different things happening in the food web. The first is biomagnification, which is a factor increase in each trophic level. So in other words, you have a certain factor of mercury in water. Um, there's an 1,000 or 100,000 times increase between water and that next trophic level algae. Then as you move up through your benthic macroinvertebrates like your caddisflies and your mayflies to your prey fish like your young trout to your larger predatory fish like large brown trout, you see a magnification as you go up in each step. At the same time as biomagnification, you have bioaccumulation occurring. And that's essentially the concept that top predatory fish that are consuming other fish from lower on the food web are accumulating the mercury already embedded in the tissue of those prey fish in their tissue when they're eating. This is why when we think about fish that are high in mercury, we typically think of top level predatory fish that are long lived, like a black bass. The exposure impacts of mercury are most significant on those with developing nervous and immune systems. So children, babies in utero, and infants. And that exposure can result in the slow development of fine motor skills and ADHD, as well as other neurological deficits. When we think of who's at risk, we, as I've said, think about women, infants, and children, women because they can be pregnant. We think that low-income women in particular are at risk because you have female-led households that are experiencing poverty and perhaps supplementing food budgets with locally caught fish. We think about tribes, our First Nations that have historically relied on local fish consumption for cultural practices, and the fact that in order to continue to practice those cultural practices, they need to have access to fish. And then we think about Spanish-speaking populations and other non-English speaking populations that may not have access to fish consumption advisory information due to language barriers. There's a few myths associated with our work addressing mercury in fish in the Sierra Nevada headwaters. The first that we confronted back in 2009 was that anglers in the Gold Country are not consuming their catch. There was long a perception that anglers in the Gold Country were primarily fly fishing, catch and release. In order to dispel that myth, or at least collect the data to back up assumptions around it, we conducted the Gold Country Angler Survey. This was a survey of 374 anglers between 2009 and 2015. And what we found was nearly half of anglers are consuming their catch in the Gold Country. 36% who eat their catch are also feeding it to their children. And, almost half are feeding it to women of childbearing age, and then some are feeding that locally caught fish to pregnant and nursing women as well. The second myth we've addressed through our work around mercury in fish is the idea that Gold Country water bodies are clean, and so the fish in them must be clean as well. This myth was partially based on the fact that in the Bay Delta, there has long been fish advisories posted at water bodies, providing public health guidelines about which species of fish are safe to eat and which are not. And so there was a large awareness around the idea that fish in the Bay Delta might be contaminated with mercury. But that same did not hold true of water bodies directly in the Gold Country, where we actually saw the highest and most direct use of mercury during the gold rush. So in exploring this myth, we pulled together data both from fish consumption advisories and from other sources like the California Environmental Data Exchange Network, CDN, to look at whether or not, at a very general and illustrative level, different species of fish at Sierra Nevada water bodies are indeed safe to eat by all populations. And so what you're looking at here is you're looking at a list of water bodies in the Sierra Nevada, and then you're looking at different species of fish or species group. And species of fish that are standing out to me are the black bass, where we have lots of these red squares, where red is meaning that for a sensitive population, that species of fish would be listed as a do not eat species in a fish consumption advisory. Where we're seeing the green, that's where these species of fish would be safe for consumption by a sensitive population, so women and children. And what we're seeing here is that rainbow trout, generally speaking, are a safe species of fish. And then sunfish are sort of an intermediate species of fish. And basically the takeaway message here is that black bass, because it is a top of the food web predatory species, is typically high in mercury, and rainbow trout is typically a low mercury choice for fish consumption. The third myth that we confronted through our activities around mercury in fish was the myth that if fish are contaminated, advisories exist and are posted. So the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment issues fish consumption advisories for specific water bodies where there is enough data for an advisory to be developed. The idea that if fish are contaminated, advisories exist and are posted is a myth, because advisories only exist if there's sufficient data, but that doesn't necessarily mean the fish are not contaminated. If there's not an advisory, it can just mean that there is not sufficient data. The other component of this myth is that if there's advisories, they're posted, which until the passage of AB 762 in 2020, no one was actually required to post advisories, even if they had been developed. To confront this myth, the Sierra Fund launched a Post-it Day project in 2015. The concept of Post-it Day was to go out and post state-issued fish consumption advisories at water bodies where they apply. We have continued this event every year. We are now entering 2020, so our 6th year doing this annual Post-it Day event. And as a result of this, water bodies in the Sierra Nevada region are posted with fish advisories. Under AB 762, water bodies statewide with site-specific advisories will be required to be posted. So we're really excited about that step forward in provision of information about the safe consumption of fish. The fourth myth that we've confronted with our mercury fish work is the idea that anglers understand and use information from posted advisories to inform which species they consume. So we collected, as a component of our Gold Country Angler Survey, information on whether anglers had ever seen health warnings about fish. And then we surveyed, if they said yes, whether or not they understood the information contained in a fish advisory. So did they understand something about the species of fish they were consuming, which population group they were in, and then how often they could consume fish. And basically what we found was that while most anglers had seen or heard warnings about eating fish, which is great, 81% are vaguely aware that fish consumption advisories exist. However, of those 81%, nearly none, 1%, could articulate information on all three components, species, population group, and frequency of consumption, that would allow them to make an informed choice about fish consumption. So 24% could articulate something about one issue and 7% on two. So what this tells us is that anglers are aware that fish consumption advisories exist. However, they are not able to use that information to make informed choices. The second component of our Environmentally Healthy Communities program is dusty exposures. Here, the gold rush connection is that the Sierra Nevada has really unique geology. There's lots of gold, but there's also constituents that can be harmful to public health, including arsenic, asbestos, and lead. When rock was excavated and crushed at hard rock mines, some of these more concerning constituents were brought above ground and, produced in a form that could be dusty. This waste was spread over large areas. Abandoned mines are now used often for recreation. They are often state parks or trail systems. And then in addition, the rock was used for many things like construction, fill, and road base. So we worry about this because if you have these constituents arsenic, asbestos, and lead, and they've been crushed. The main exposure route for public exposure is through the inhalation of this contaminated dust or the ingestion of it, which is particularly a concern for children who are low to the ground and spend a lot of time outdoors and in the dirt. Recreating, generally speaking, creates dust. And so when you're inhaling that dust, the exposure impacts in terms of the different constituents can be, arsenic, you can have issues associated with organs of the gastrointestinal tract, your heart, brain, and kidney. Asbestos is associated with cancers of the lung, larynx, and ovary. And then lead is a well-known neurological impact and gastrointestinal impact associated constituent. And so it's considered lethal to fetuses and children. We know this pretty well from issues around lead in paint, but inhaling lead can also be an issue. So what are some best practices around dusty exposures? We've learned through our work looking at abandoned hard rock mines that it's very important to do historical analysis before sampling and making a determination if there is a potential for dusty exposures. And this is because at mines, certain activities may have been associated with higher levels of contamination. And so if we know where those activities took place and we collect samples from those locations, soil samples, to see if there is an issue with dusty exposure, that's much more informed than just choosing a bunch of random locations across an abandoned mine land to sample from, because we could actually miss some of the contamination that is in very specific areas. So know where to look. And we've done a recreational trails assessment around this in terms of if you have a trail across abandoned mines, is there a potential for exposure? And then also the hard rock mine assessment, the champion mine acquisition. You can use your sampling outcomes to inform land uses. So in many cases, the best use of an area where dusty exposure may be an issue is no use. Or the best use may be avoidance of certain areas, or there may not be an issue at all. And then finally, you can take steps to minimize exposure. And this is really important in particular for members of the public. You can avoid dusty activities. Pardon me, skipped ahead too quickly. You can avoid dusty activities. You can bag contaminated clothing and wipe down dusty surfaces, including your hair, pet feet, etc., to avoid transfer into homes. Other things you can do is just know that if you're out recreating somewhere that's dusty, maybe choose not to travel directly behind a group producing a lot of dust. Maybe provide more space between yourself and someone else when dust is being created. Those types of common sense best practices. Water quality and water access is another component of our environmentally healthy communities program. Here, the gold rush connection is that our rivers and streams were historically used to convey mine waste downstream. This was in particular true at hydraulic mine sites where large portions of hillsides were washed away to access ancient river deposits where there was gold. And so rivers and streams were very convenient ways to convey away, that excessive mud and wood and debris. Much of the water infrastructure of the gold country dates to the gold rush. And then finally, there are legacy mine sites everywhere, many of which continue to transport mercury contaminated sediment off of them, many of which continue to leach contaminated mill sands into water bodies. So on the right, you're looking at a map of the Nevada City Grass Valley area. Water bodies that are hard to see but are in a really kind of bright turquoise are water bodies that are listed under Clean Water Act Section 303D as contaminated for mercury. And all the red dots are historic mines, legacy mines of the gold rush. A particular issue in terms of water quality and water access in the gold country is a particular issue of water quality and water access in the gold country is that there's such a diversity of water users. You are very rural, so you have rural wells and septics, you have small water systems at mobile home parks, you have some homeowners being serviced by Nevada Irrigation District. You have others being serviced by city water services. So in addition to this multiplicity of issues, we know that the Sierra Nevada is home to disadvantaged and underserved communities, or DACs. And so when you're looking at the map on the right, you're looking at, in dark brown, communities that are considered to be severely disadvantaged based on the median household income in proportion to the statewide median household income. We are concerned about disadvantaged communities and water quality and water access because the needs of disadvantaged communities may not be being articulated in planning processes and funding allocation processes to address water quality and water access. And so these communities are being left out of these very important decision-making processes around, what we consider to be a human right to water. There's other challenges in the region, including being safe from floods and sewage in these rural gold rush towns. And finally, we worry about First Nation access to water because access to water for our First Nation communities can be a key component of cultural practices and the ability to continue to engage in those practices. We take an environmental justice approach, in particular with regard to our water quality and water access work. We are working to engage with underserved and underrepresented community members so that we can better understand their water quality and water access needs. We're trying to ensure participation of these disadvantaged communities in decision-making processes around water. And then we are thinking about the inclusion of the broader human right to water perspective and how we plan for water access in the headwaters. The final component of our Environmentally Healthy Communities program is air quality and wildfire. The Gold Rush connection to air quality and wildfire is that forests were clear-cut during the Gold Rush to build the towns, to timber the mines, to fuel the stamp mills. And after the Gold Rush, that initial clear cut, fire was suppressed for over 100 years. And so we had these very even age monoculture type forests that grew back very, very densely. At the same time, we have towns growing up in the wildland-urban interface, or the WUI. So it's sort of a recipe for potential disaster because you have many homes and these small communities in these very densely forested areas. Nevada County in particular has extensive, very high fire hazard severity zones, and 75% of homes in the county are in these high to extreme risk areas. So 75% of homes are, very much in the WUI. From a public health perspective, exposure to particulate matter, and in particular fine particulate matter, or what we think of as PM 2.5, is the principal public health threat from short-term exposures to wildfire smoke. And when we have wildfires, the most common advisory that is issued is to stay indoors. And that's because indoors, air can be recirculated and potentially you can provide yourself with a cleaner airspace when you are indoors. Exposure to the fine particulate matter, or that PM 2.5 in wildfire smoke, can irritate your eyes and respiratory tract, result in reduced lung function, bronchitis, exacerbate existing conditions like asthma. There's a documented uptick in the number of emergency room related asthma admissions during wildfire. Exposure to smoke can also exacerbate heart conditions and potentially lead to premature death. When we think of who's at risk for exposure, we're thinking about children because they have developing lungs and they spend a lot of time outside. Pregnant women because of increases in blood and plasma volume and increased respiratory rates. And there you're talking about exposure for both mother and fetus. Older adults because of pre-existing conditions. And then other factors come into play, specifically socioeconomic status, because it's linked to pre-existing conditions, but it can also impact the resources that could be used to minimize exposure. So, for example, if the advice is to stay indoors and recirculate air, but you're low income and don't have an air condition system, then that could potentially be something that impacts your ability to minimize exposure. We're exploring solutions around wildfire and air quality by looking at gaps in the protection of public health. So, one gap is that disadvantaged communities or DACs lack equal access to fire prevention and planning resources. So, we are working to identify disadvantaged communities adjacent to firewise communities and then basically build the community will of these areas of the community where there is more capacity to address wildfire and fuels reduction to expand their inclusion to adjacent disadvantaged communities, which both benefits the DACs as well as the more affluent or communities with greater capacity. The second gap we're looking at is emergency preparedness tools and the fact that they're not targeted specifically to disadvantaged communities. So we've found that in some Sierra Nevada communities, services like Code Red, where you get emergency notifications about wildfire, are not offered in Spanish. And so we have worked to ensure that information about how to plan for wildfire, how to evacuate in the instance of emergencies, um, that those channels of information are being opened up for folks that don't speak English as a first language. The third gap we're looking at is that there's not publicly accessible cleaner air spaces for your. The third gap we're looking at is that there's not publicly accessible cleaner air spaces for use during wildfire. So this is back to the concept that if you have a wildfire, the primary recommendation is that you stay indoors. And if you don't have the ability to stay indoors in a space that would potentially offer you cleaner air because you're able to recirculate that air, where do you go? And so we've been looking to identify public health stakeholders and inventory potential spaces where we live that could provide cleaner air and create a strategy for how there would be access to cleaner air spaces for everyone. Not unlike having access to warming shelters for homeless populations, how can we build the community will and create a framework for ensuring equitable access during wildfire? So some of the specific things we've looked at in terms of creating an inventory of cleaner air spaces is looking at whether or not spaces can provide cleaner air. So back to that ability to turn on the air conditioning or the HVAC and recirculate air, whether a space would be large enough to shelter a number of people, whether it would be suitable. So could you have young children? Could you have elderly and disabled? That it would be accessible to all and that you'd have air conditioning to prevent heat stress. And this is an interesting component because you need to have the ability to recirculate, but because wildfire often happens most often during very high heat times of the year, so the late summer and fall, any cleaner air shelter that you provided would need to have air conditioning explicitly in addition to HVAC in order to prevent heat stress. Creating an inventory of spaces and the Sierra Fund's work around air quality and wildfire is the newest component of our environmentally healthy communities. But it's a component that we heard from the ground level in our community was sort of the aspect of environmental health of greatest concern to our local community members. And so we have taken on addressing this and identifying these different gaps around the provision of cleaner air spaces and inclusion of DACs and wildfire planning, because this is a way that we can serve our communities of the headwaters of the Sierra Nevada. I encourage you to look into other aspects of our Lunch and Learn series. We have been addressing a suite of topics since May, And these presentations are available online if you want to explore individual aspects of our Environmentally Healthy Communities program or learn about our capacity building program, our ecosystem resiliency program, and different project components associated with these programs. We invite you to join us in restoring resiliency to California's headwaters, both by learning more about our projects, by getting involved, by advocating for environmental health for all, and by supporting responsible legislation. Visit our website, www.sierrafund.org, for more information. And contact us. Thanks so much.